Maria Santos stepped off the bus at Fort Benning with nothing but a worn duffel bag and determination burning in her chest. The Georgia heat hit her like a slap, but she had endured worse. Much worse. At 22, she was older than most recruits, and the reason for her late entry into the military was written across her body in scars that told a story she wasn't ready to share. The reception area buzzed with nervous energy as dozens of young men and women processed through the initial paperwork. Maria kept her head down, filling out forms with the same careful precision she applied to everything in her life. When the medical forms asked about previous injuries, she hesitated for a moment before checking several boxes. The details, she knew, would come later during the physical examination. Santos, Maria Elena, called Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact woman with steel in her voice and eyes that seemed to see everything. Maria stepped forward, shoulders straight despite the weight of exhaustion from the overnight bus ride from Los Angeles. "Yes, Sergeant. You're older than most of these kids. What took you so long to find us?" Maria met her gaze steadily. "Life had other plans first, Sergeant." Rodriguez studied her for a moment, noting something in Maria's posture that spoke of experiences beyond her years. There was a stillness about this recruit that was unusual. Most young people fidgeted, looked around nervously, or tried to impress. Maria simply stood and waited, as if she had learned patience in a hard school. The first few days of processing blurred together in a haze of vaccinations, paperwork, uniform fittings, and constant movement. Maria observed everything, said little, and drew minimal attention to herself. She had learned long ago that being invisible was often the safest strategy. Her bunkmates were a mix of backgrounds and personalities. There was Jennifer Walsh from Iowa, blonde and athletic, who talked constantly about her high school track records. Marcus Thompson from Detroit had joined to escape the streets and spoke in rapid bursts about his plans to become a medic. Sarah Chen from San Francisco was quiet like Maria, but, in a different way, her silence came from shyness rather than experience. It was during the first group shower that the whispers started. The military didn't offer much privacy, and communal showers were a fact of life that everyone had to adjust to. Maria had known this moment would come and had mentally prepared herself. When she undressed, the evidence of her past was impossible to hide. Surgical scars crisscrossed her torso in neat lines that spoke of multiple operations. On her left shoulder, a jagged mark told a different story, one of trauma rather than healing. Her back bore evidence of burns, long since healed but still visible as patches of differently textured skin. The shower room fell silent. Jennifer was the first to find her voice, though she tried to whisper. "What happened to her?" "Must have been in some kind of accident," Marcus muttered, not quite as quietly as he thought. Maria continued washing methodically, giving no indication she heard the speculation swirling around her. She had endured worse than whispers and stares. But, when she turned to grab her towel, she caught Sarah's eye. The younger woman wasn't staring with curiosity or shock, there was something else there. Recognition, perhaps. Or understanding. Over the following days, as the real training began, the whispers evolved into something more pointed. The physical demands of basic training were designed to push everyone to their limits, and Maria's body, while strong, bore the limitations of her past trauma. During morning PT, she struggled with certain exercises that required full range of motion in her left arm. The burn scars on her back pulled tight during stretching routines. When they ran, her gait was slightly off, noticeable to trained eyes because of the way old injuries had healed. Drill Sergeant Peterson was a mountain of a man who seemed to take personal offense at any display of weakness. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had little patience for what he perceived as coddled civilians playing soldier. "Santos," he bellowed during their 3rd week. "Is there a particular reason you're moving like you're made of glass?" Maria pushed through another push-up, her form perfect despite the obvious strain. "No excuse, Drill Sergeant. No excuse is right. This isn't a rehabilitation center. This is the United States Army. If you can't keep up, there's a bus leaving for home every day." Some of the other recruits exchanged glances. Peterson's harassment of Maria had become a daily spectacle, and, while some felt uncomfortable about it, others began to see her as weak link in their unit.
The breaking point came during a field exercise in their fourth week.
The platoon was practicing tactical movement through a simulated urban environment. Maria was assigned to carry the radio, a critical responsibility that required her to stay close to the team leader while maintaining communication with headquarters. The exercise was going well until they encountered a simulated ambush. In the confusion of smoke grenades and blank rounds, Maria dove for cover behind a concrete barrier. The movement was instinctive, perfect tactically, but it aggravated the old injury in her shoulder. She felt something tear, followed by a wave of pain that made her vision blur. But she didn't drop the radio. Even as pain shot through her arm and back, she maintained contact with headquarters, calling in their position and requesting backup. Her voice remained steady and professional even as sweat beaded on her forehead from the effort of staying conscious. Jennifer, crouched nearby, watched in amazement as Maria continued to perform her duties despite obvious distress. But when the exercise ended and they were loading back onto the transport vehicles, Jennifer's admiration curdled into something else. "She's going to get us all in trouble," Jennifer whispered to Marcus as they watched Maria carefully favor her left side.
"Look at her. She can barely move. What happens when this isn't practice?"
Marcus nodded, his expression troubled. "I mean, I respect that she's trying, but Peterson's right.
This isn't the place for someone who can't keep up."
The sentiment spread through the group like a virus.
By evening chow, Maria could feel the shift in atmosphere around her. Conversations stopped when she approached.
Eyes followed her movements, cataloging every sign of limitation or weakness.
Sarah was the only one who seemed immune to the growing hostility.
She sat with Maria during meals and made small talk about their hometowns. During one such conversation, she finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air.
"You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," Sarah said quietly, "but were you in an accident?" Maria considered the question carefully.
The truth was complicated, and she had learned that sometimes partial truth was safer than complete honesty or outright lies. "Something like that," she said finally.
"When I was younger." Sarah nodded and didn't push for details.
There was something in her manner that suggested she understood the weight of secrets.
The harassment escalated during their fifth week.
Peterson had moved beyond simple verbal criticism to what felt like targeted punishment. He assigned Maria extra duties, criticized her performance even when it was exemplary, and made comments about damaged goods that walked the line of what was officially acceptable. The other recruits began to take their cue from him.
Equipment went missing from Maria's bunk.
Her boots were mysteriously filled with shaving cream one morning. During group exercises, she was consistently assigned the most physically demanding tasks, regardless of what made tactical sense. Maria endured it all with the same quiet determination she had shown from the beginning. She completed every assignment, met every physical requirement, and never complained or made excuses.
But the strain was beginning to show.
It was Jennifer who finally voiced what many were thinking during a late-night discussion in the barracks.
"Look, I'm not trying to be mean," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room.
"But some of us have been talking, and we're worried.
What if we get deployed together? What if she can't keep up when lives are on the line?"
The room fell silent. Maria lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the conversation about her as if she weren't there. "I mean, she's obviously been through something terrible," Jennifer continued.
"And that's really sad. But this is the military. We have to be able to depend on each other." Marcus shifted uncomfortably but didn't disagree.
Several others murmured agreement. Only Sarah remained silent. "Maybe someone should talk to the drill sergeants," suggested another voice from across the room.
"I mean, if she's not fit for duty, isn't it better to find out now?"
Maria closed her eyes and forced her breathing to remain steady. She had heard similar conversations before, in different contexts. After the incident that had left her scarred, there had been social workers and doctors and well-meaning relatives who had discussed her future in similar terms. They had debated her limitations, her prospects, her ability to function normally, all while she listened from the next room or pretended to sleep. She had proven them wrong then, and she would prove this group wrong now. The next morning brought a new challenge: hand-to-hand combat training. The recruits were paired off for basic grappling exercises, learning to defend themselves and subdue opponents. Maria found herself matched against Jennifer, who was taller and had several pounds on her.
"I'll take it easy on you," Jennifer said, not unkindly. "I know your shoulder's been bothering you."
The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and, for the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, Maria felt a flash of real anger. She had spent years being underestimated, being handled with kid gloves, being treated as if she were fragile.
She was done with it.
When the drill sergeant signaled the start of the exercise, Jennifer moved slowly, telegraphing her intentions clearly. She was obviously trying to give Maria a chance to defend herself without getting hurt.
Maria's response was swift and decisive.
Using techniques learned not in any martial arts class but in life or death situations, she redirected Jennifer's momentum, swept her legs, and had her on the ground in less than 3 seconds. Jennifer found herself flat on her back, staring up at the sky, with Maria's knee on her chest and a very different expression in her dark eyes. "Time," called the drill sergeant, and Maria immediately released the hold and helped Jennifer to her feet.
"Where did you learn that?" Jennifer gasped, more shocked than hurt.
Maria's expression had already returned to its usual neutral state.
"Here and there."
But the mood in the barracks had shifted again.
The casual dismissal of Maria as a weak link was replaced by a new uncertainty.
There was clearly more to their quiet bunkmate than anyone had realized, and her competence in hand-to-hand combat raised new questions about her background. Peterson, who had witnessed the exercise, said nothing. But Maria caught him studying her with a different expression than before, not dismissive, but calculating. That evening, as the recruits cleaned their weapons and prepared for lights out, the conversations around Maria were different. Instead of whispered concerns about her limitations, there were speculative discussions about her past. The scars that had initially marked her as damaged goods now seemed like evidence of survival rather than weakness. But Maria knew this respite was temporary. The physical demands of training would only increase, and her body's limitations would become more apparent. The real test was still coming, and she had to be ready for it. As she lay in her bunk that night, listening to the quiet breathing of her sleeping bunkmates, Maria allowed herself to remember the last time she had been underestimated. It had nearly cost her everything. But she had survived then, and she had learned valuable lessons about the difference between appearing weak and being weak. The scars on her body told a story of trauma and pain, but they also told a story of survival and strength. Soon, she thought, the others would understand the difference. And, when they did, they might finally see her not as a liability, but as someone who had already been tested in ways they couldn't imagine. The real question was whether she was ready to share that story, and whether they were ready to hear it. Week 6 brought the crucible that would define the rest of Maria's time in basic training. The exercise was called Urban Warfare Simulation, and it was designed to test every skill they had learned in a high-stress environment that mimicked real combat conditions. The scenario was complex. Their unit was tasked with securing a mock city block while evacuating civilians and neutralizing enemy combatants. It would require teamwork, quick thinking, and physical endurance. Most importantly, it would require trust between team members. Maria could feel the weight of her platoon's skepticism as they suited up in full gear. Despite her performance in hand-to-hand combat, the whispers had resumed. Her visible struggle during the previous week's ruck march had reignited concerns about her physical limitations. "Listen up, soldiers," barked Sergeant Peterson as they gathered around a sand table model of the training area. "This is as close to real combat as you're going to get without someone actually shooting at you. Every decision matters. Every mistake has consequences." He pointed to various positions on the model. "Team Alpha will approach from the north. Team Bravo takes the east. Charlie Team provides overwatch from this position here." His finger jabbed at a 3-story building in the center of the mock town. "Any questions?" Jennifer raised her hand. "Sergeant, who's calling the shots for each team?" Peterson's eyes swept over the assembled recruits before settling on Maria. "Santos, your team leader for Charlie Team."
Walsh, you've got Alpha. Thompson, Bravo is yours. The announcement hit the group like a physical blow. Several recruits exchanged glances of disbelief.
Maria herself was surprised but showed no emotion beyond a slight straightening of her shoulders.
Sergeant, Jennifer began carefully, are you sure about, did I stutter, Walsh? Peterson's voice could have cut glass. Santos has been scoring consistently high on tactical assessments and weapons handling.
She's demonstrated situational awareness and decision-making under pressure.
Unless you have specific tactical concerns about the assignment?
Jennifer's mouth opened and closed without sound.
She couldn't argue with Maria's test scores or her performance in individual skills without sounding petty or prejudiced. No, Sergeant. No concerns. Outstanding. Teams have 30 minutes to plan. Move out.
As the groups dispersed to different corners of the preparation area, Maria found herself with Sarah Chen and two other recruits, David Kim, a quiet engineering student from California, and Robert Jackson, a former college football player from Alabama. Jackson had been one of the more vocal critics of Maria's place in the unit.
So, Jackson said, not bothering to hide his skepticism, what's the plan, team leader?
Maria spread out the map and photos they had been given. Her finger traced the building they were assigned to secure.
3 stories, multiple entry points, good sightlines to the street.
Our job is to provide overwatch for the other teams and coordinate with headquarters.
Sounds simple enough, David said. What's the catch?
There's always a catch, Maria replied.
Look at the windows on the 2nd floor.
Boarded up on the east side, clear on the west.
If I were setting up an ambush, that's where I'd put a sniper. We go in expecting contact.
Sarah leaned closer to study the photos.
What about civilians?
The briefing said there would be role players acting as non-combatants.
Good point. Maria made notes on her map. We clear each floor methodically. No assumptions about who's friendly until we verify. Jackson, you take point.
Your size gives us an advantage in close quarters. Kim, you're our tech specialist. I want you monitoring radio traffic and watching for electronic countermeasures.
Chen, you're with me on Overwatch once we secure the position. Jackson frowned. What about you? Where do you fit in this plan?
The question carried an undercurrent of challenge that everyone heard. Maria met his gaze steadily.
I'm team leader.
My job is to make decisions, coordinate with other teams, and adapt the plan when things go wrong.
Which they will. And if you can't keep up physically?
The question hung in the air like smoke.
Sarah shifted uncomfortably while David pretended to study the map more closely. Then, I'll deal with that when it happens, Maria said simply. Right now, we have a mission to plan. Any other tactical concerns?
Jackson held her stare for another moment before shaking his head.
No, ma'am.
The use of ma'am was deliberately formal, almost mocking, but Maria let it pass. She had bigger concerns than one recruit's attitude.
20 minutes later, the teams moved into position.
The mock town was eerily realistic, complete with scattered debris, abandoned vehicles, and the sound of distant gunfire from other training exercises.
The smell of smoke from pyrotechnics hung heavy in the humid Georgia air. Charlie team approached their target building with textbook precision.
Jackson proved his worth immediately, spotting tripwires that could have triggered noisemakers and blown their stealth approach. David's technical skills came into play when they discovered a mock electronic jamming device that could have disrupted their communications. But it was Maria's leadership that held the team together when everything started going wrong. They had just reached the 2nd floor when the simulation erupted into chaos. Hidden speakers blared the sound of incoming artillery.
Smoke grenades filled the stairwell.
And, from somewhere in the building came the sound of civilians screaming for help.
Contact front. Jackson shouted as a role player in enemy uniform appeared at the end of the hallway.
The laser tag system they were using registered his simulated weapon fire, and red lights began flashing on David's gear, indicating he had been killed. Kim's down, Sarah called out, stating the obvious for the radio net.
We're pinned in the stairwell. Maria's mind raced through options.
The mission was falling apart, but that was exactly the point of the exercise.
How they responded to failure would determine their grade.
Jackson, suppressing fire down the hallway.
Chen, check on the civilians.
I'm going to flank right through that classroom.
The door's locked, Sarah protested. Not for long.
Maria pulled a simulated breaching charge from her kit. In reality, it was just a noisemaker that would simulate an explosion, but the tactical principle was sound.
What happened next would be debated by the platoon for weeks afterward.
Instead of simply placing the charge and taking cover, Maria did something that caught everyone off guard. She kicked open a window, secured a rappelling rope to a support beam, and disappeared over the side of the building.
What the hell is she doing?
Jackson muttered into his radio. His question was answered 30 seconds later when the enemy soldier who had been pinning them down suddenly stopped firing. Through the smoke and chaos, they could see Maria had somehow appeared behind him, having climbed through a ground floor window and up an interior stairwell they hadn't known existed.
Enemy neutralized, Maria's voice crackled through their radios.
Advancing to secure the civilians.
The rest of the exercise became a masterclass in tactical improvisation.
When their communications with other teams were jammed, Maria used hand signals and positioning to coordinate with the other team leaders. When a chemical attack forced them to don gas masks, she adapted their formation to maintain effectiveness despite reduced visibility. And, when a final wave of enemy reinforcements threatened to overrun their position, she called in artillery support so precisely that the evaluating sergeants actually applauded. By the time the exercise ended, Charlie Team had not only completed their primary mission but had also assisted in the success of both Alpha and Bravo teams. Their casualty rate was the lowest of any team, and their tactical innovation scores were off the charts.
As they gathered for the after-action review, the mood among the recruits was subdued.
Everything they thought they knew about Maria Santos had been turned upside down in the span of 2 hours. Outstanding work, Charlie Team, announced Captain Williams, the officer who had been observing their performance. Santos, that window exit was unorthodox, but it showed tactical thinking and initiative.
Where did you learn to rappel like that? Maria's response was typically understated. Previous experience, sir. What kind of previous experience? Williams pressed. For the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, Maria hesitated.
The question touched on areas of her past she wasn't ready to discuss, even with a superior officer.
Emergency rescue training, sir. Civilian program.
It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either.
The skills she had demonstrated came from a much more complex background than any civilian rescue program could provide. Williams nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Well, whatever training you had, it served you well today.
Team leaders, gather your people for individual debriefs.
Dismissed.
As the group began to disperse, Jennifer Walsh approached Maria with an expression that was difficult to read.
That was impressive, she said carefully. I owe you an apology.
Maria shouldered her deer and turned to face her former critic.
For what? For assuming you couldn't hack it here. For talking about you like you weren't capable.
Jennifer's voice carried genuine regret.
I was wrong.
Apology accepted, Maria replied simply.
But you weren't wrong to have concerns. Every soldier should be evaluated on their performance. Today just happened to be a good day for me.
The honesty of the response caught Jennifer off guard. Most people would have rubbed their success in her face or made her feel worse about the misjudgment. Maria's gracious acceptance of the apology while acknowledging the legitimate nature of the original concern showed a maturity that Jennifer was still working toward.
Can I ask you something? Jennifer continued. You can ask. Those scars, they're not from any accident, are they?
Maria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes.
That's a complicated question. I won't push if you don't want to talk about it. But, after today, I think there's more to your story than any of us realized.
Before Maria could respond, Drill Sergeant Peterson's voice cut across the area.
Santos. Front end, center. Maria double-timed to where Peterson stood with Captain Williams and another officer she didn't recognize.
The unknown officer was older, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command.
His uniform bore the insignia of a full colonel.
"Colonel Rodriguez wanted to speak with you about today's exercise," Peterson explained. Colonel Rodriguez studied Maria with interest.
"Son and daughter, I've been watching your performance for the past several weeks. Today's exercise was particularly noteworthy. Tell me, what's your background prior to enlisting?"
The question was direct and official. Maria knew she had to be careful with her answer, but she also couldn't afford to lie to a senior officer. "Various jobs, sir.
Some security work. Some volunteer emergency response."
Security work?
Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of security work?"
Maria felt the trap closing around her. The truth was complicated and would lead to questions she couldn't answer. But lies would be easily discovered if Rodriguez decided to dig deeper into her background.
"Personal protection, sir. Some corporate security consulting." It was true, as far as it went.
What she didn't mention was that her clients had included federal witnesses, foreign diplomats, and other individuals whose protection required skills far beyond what typical security work demanded. Rodriguez exchanged glances with Captain Williams.
"Personal protection."
That would explain the tactical awareness and the unconventional problem-solving.
"Anyone I might know?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss specific clients, sir. Confidentiality agreements."
"Of course."
Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Professional discretion is important in that line of work." "Well, Santos, I'm impressed with your performance. Keep up the good work."
"Yes, sir."
"Thank you, sir."
As she was dismissed and began walking back toward the barracks, Maria knew the conversation had only postponed the inevitable. Her background was too unusual to remain unexamined indefinitely, and her skills were too advanced for someone with her supposed training. Sooner or later, someone would ask the right questions or look in the right places, and then the truth would come out. But, for now, she had earned a measure of respect from her fellow recruits and her superiors. The whispers about her limitations had been replaced by speculation about her background. It was progress, of a sort. That evening, as the platoon sat around cleaning weapons and gear, the conversation was markedly different than it had been in previous weeks. "I'm telling you," Marcus was saying to a group gathered around his bunk, "she moved like someone who's done that stuff for real. You don't learn that kind of situational awareness in any civilian program." "She had to have been military before," suggested another recruit. "Maybe she was discharged for medical reasons and came back when she got better." Sarah, who was cleaning her rifle nearby, listened without comment. She had her own theories about Maria's background, but, unlike the others, she wasn't sharing them with the group. Maria herself sat at her own bunk, methodically cleaning her gear and listening to the speculation without participating. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle curiosity was to let people draw their own conclusions. The truth was usually more unbelievable than anything they could imagine. But, as she prepared for lights out, Maria knew that her performance in the exercise had been both a blessing and a curse. She had gained the respect she needed to function effectively in the unit, but she had also raised questions that could eventually lead to discoveries she wasn't ready to handle. The scars on her body told only part of her story. The skills she had displayed today told another part. But the complete truth about who she had been before Maria Santos enlisted in the army was something she hoped would never come to light. Because if it did, her new life as a soldier would be over before it had truly begun. The night before their final field exercise, Maria couldn't sleep. She lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of 20 other recruits breathing in the darkness. Tomorrow would be their culminating event, a week-long exercise in the field that would test everything they had learned and determine whether they graduated or recycled through additional training. More importantly, it would be their last test as a cohesive unit before they received their permanent assignments. For Maria, it represented both an opportunity to prove herself once and for all, and a risk that her carefully constructed new identity might finally unravel completely. The whispers about her background hadn't stopped after the urban warfare exercise.
If anything, they had intensified.
Her tactical skills were too advanced, her situational awareness too sharp, her comfort with weapons and combat scenarios too natural for someone who claimed only civilian security experience. Sarah rolled over in the bunk next to hers, and Maria caught the faint whisper of her voice.
"Can't sleep either?" Maria turned her head slightly. "Just thinking about tomorrow. Want to talk about it?"
It was a simple question, but Maria heard the deeper offer beneath it. Sarah had been watching and listening for weeks now, and Maria suspected she had drawn conclusions that came uncomfortably close to the truth. "Not much to talk about," Maria replied quietly.
"We go out, we complete the mission, we come back. Is that really all there is to it?" Sarah's voice was barely audible, but in the quiet of the barracks it seemed loud. "Because I've been thinking about some things, and I don't think your story is as simple as you make it sound." Maria tensed slightly. "I don't know what you mean."
"Those scars.
The way you move. How you handled that exercise last week."
Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully.
"I've seen scars like yours before. My sister was a nurse in a trauma center.
She used to tell me stories about the patients who came in from difficult situations.
Gunshot wounds. Knife attacks.
Burns from fires that weren't accidental."
The silence stretched between them.
Maria could feel her pulse quickening, but her voice remained steady when she finally responded.
"Your sister sounds like she had a tough job."
"She did. She also told me that people who survive those kinds of situations, they develop certain skills.
Awareness. Quick reflexes. The ability to assess threats and respond appropriately." Another pause. "Sound familiar?"
Maria sat up slightly, turning to face Sarah in the darkness.
"What exactly are you trying to say?"
"I'm saying that I don't think you're just someone who worked security for corporate executives.
I think something happened to you, something bad, and you learned to fight back. And I think that's why you're here." The conversation was moving into dangerous territory.
Maria had prepared for many scenarios, but she hadn't expected one of her bunkmates to piece together this much of the truth.
"Even if that were true," Maria said carefully, "it wouldn't change anything.
We're all here for our own reasons."
"No, you're right.
It wouldn't change anything about your ability to be a soldier.
But it might change how the rest of us see you."
Sarah's voice carried a warmth that surprised Maria. "Right now, half the platoon thinks you're hiding some kind of special forces background.
They're intimidated. The other half still thinks you might wash out because of your injuries."
But the truth is probably more complicated than either of those things. Before Maria could respond, a harsh whisper cut through the darkness from across the barracks.
"Will you two shut up? Some of us are trying to sleep."
Both women fell silent, but the conversation had opened something that couldn't easily be closed. Maria lay back down, but her mind was racing.
Sarah's perceptiveness was both reassuring and terrifying.
It was good to know that at least one person in the unit saw her as more than just a collection of limitations or mysterious skills. But it was dangerous to have someone who might start asking the kinds of questions that could lead to uncomfortable answers.
The next morning brought chaos from the moment they woke up.
Instead of the usual reveille call, the barracks erupted with the sound of simulated explosions and shouting instructors.
"This is not a drill." Sergeant Peterson's voice boomed through a bullhorn. "Enemy forces have overrun the base. All personnel will evacuate to secondary positions immediately." The recruits scrambled to dress and gather their gear in the simulated emergency. This was it, the beginning of their final exercise, and the instructors were throwing them into high-stress conditions from the very first moment. Maria moved efficiently through her preparations, muscle memory taking over as she checked weapons, secured equipment, and prepared for whatever scenario they were about to face. Around her, other recruits showed varying levels of readiness.
Jennifer was quick and organized, Marcus struggled with his pack straps, and Sarah moved with quiet competence that reminded Maria of her perceptiveness the night before. Move, move, move. The instructors were herding them toward the exit, but the simulation wasn't just about speed. As they reached the door, they were handed scenario cards that would define their roles for the week-long exercise. Maria glanced at her card, Sergeant Maria Santos, Communications Specialist, Alpha Company.
Your unit has been separated from the main force during the evacuation.
Maintain communication with headquarters and coordinate with other scattered units to regroup at Rally Point Charlie. The promotion to sergeant was artificial, part of the exercise scenario, but it came with real responsibilities. She would be leading a squad of 8 recruits, including several who had been among her harshest critics. As they formed up outside the barracks, Captain Williams appeared with a group of observer controllers who would be evaluating their performance.
Ladies and gentlemen, Williams announced, for the next week, this base does not exist.
You are scattered survivors of an enemy assault, and your mission is to evade capture while conducting guerrilla operations against enemy forces. You will be hunted by an opposing force made up of advanced infantry training soldiers. You will have limited food and water. You will sleep on the ground. And you will be evaluated on every decision you make. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. Squad leaders, you have your assignments.
Communications will be limited to predetermined check-in times. Medical support is available for genuine emergencies only. Any questions?
When no one spoke up, Williams nodded grimly.
Outstanding.
Your war begins now. The squad that Maria found herself leading was a mixed group. Jennifer was there, along with Marcus, Sarah, and, for others including Robert Jackson, who had been openly skeptical of her abilities since their first week. As they moved away from the base into the wooded training area, Maria could feel the tension in the group.
So what's the plan, Sergeant?
Jackson's use of her scenario rank was heavy with sarcasm. Maria consulted her map and compass before responding.
We move to these coordinates for our first radio check.
Then, we assess the situation and plan our next move based on what headquarters tells us.
That's not much of a plan, observed Tyler Brooks, a recruit from Montana who had remained neutral in most discussions about Maria's capabilities.
It's enough of a plan to get us started, Maria replied.
The situation is fluid. We adapt as we get more information.
As they began moving through the forest, Maria's mind was already working through multiple scenarios. The opposition force would be made up of experienced soldiers who knew these woods better than the recruits. They would have superior equipment and communications. The only advantages the recruits had were numbers and the element of unpredictability. But Maria had advantages that none of the instructors knew about. She had operated in hostile territory before, under conditions far more dangerous than any training exercise. The skills she had developed during the darkest period of her life were about to be tested in a new context. 20 minutes into their movement, she held up her hand for the squad to stop.
Something was wrong.
The forest was too quiet, and she had caught a glimpse of movement that didn't belong. We're being followed, she whispered to Jennifer, who was nearest to her.
How can you tell?
Birds.
Listen to them. Maria pointed to their left. Natural pattern is broken over there. Something is moving parallel to our route.
Jennifer strained to listen and gradually began to pick up what Maria was hearing. The subtle difference in bird calls, the slight shift in forest sounds that indicated human presence.
What do we do? Maria was already formulating a plan.
We let them think they're hunting us while we figure out who's hunting who. What followed was a masterclass in counter-surveillance that none of the recruits had expected. Instead of simply trying to evade their pursuers, Maria turned the movement into a complex game of cat and mouse. She used terrain features to mask their movement, employed misdirection to confuse their trail, and positioned the squad to gather intelligence on their opposition. Within 2 hours, they had not only evaded capture but had also identified the size and equipment of the opposing force team that was hunting them. More importantly, they had done it without alerting the hunters that they had been detected. When they reached their first radio checkpoint, Maria's report to headquarters was detailed and tactically sound. She provided precise locations of enemy forces, assessment of their capabilities, and recommendations for other scattered units in the area.
Outstanding work, Alpha Squad, came the response from headquarters. Continue to rally point Charlie and establish overwatch positions.
As they prepared to move out again, Marcus approached Maria with a troubled expression. "How did you know we were being followed back there?" he asked quietly.
Training and experience. What kind of training teaches you to read bird patterns like that?
It was the same type of question that had been following Maria since the urban warfare exercise, but this time there was less skepticism and more genuine curiosity in it. "The kind that keeps you alive in dangerous places," she replied simply.
Were you really just doing corporate security before you enlisted?
Maria stopped what she was doing and looked directly at Marcus. "I did the job I was trained to do, in the places where people needed that kind of work done. Some of those places weren't very safe." It was perhaps the most honest answer she had given anyone about her background, and Marcus seemed to sense that pushing further would cross a line she wasn't ready to cross.
The next 3 days of the exercise became a showcase of tactical skills that impressed even the observer controllers.
Maria's squad not only avoided capture but actively gathered intelligence on enemy movements, conducted successful sabotage operations against simulated targets, and coordinated with other units to disrupt the opposing forces' plans. But it was on the fourth night that everything changed. They had established a hidden observation post overlooking a key road junction when the exercise took an unexpected turn. Instead of the usual simulated combat scenarios, the opposition force introduced a new element: a captured civilian who needed to be rescued.
The scenario was designed to test decision-making under ethical pressure.
The civilian was actually an instructor playing a role, but the tactical situation was real.
The opposing force was using the capture as bait to draw scattered recruit units into a trap.
Most squad leaders, faced with this scenario, would have either avoided the situation entirely or attempted a straightforward rescue mission that would likely result in high casualties.
Maria chose a third option.
Working with intelligence gathered over the previous days, she identified a weakness in the opposing force's deployment pattern. Instead of attacking the obvious target, she planned a simultaneous operation that would rescue the civilian while capturing key members of the opposing force leadership. The plan was audacious, complex, and required precise timing. It also required her to reveal skills and knowledge that went far beyond anything that could be explained by civilian security work. As she briefed the squad on their assignments, Jennifer interrupted with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Maria, this plan is brilliant, but it's also incredibly sophisticated. Where exactly did you learn to coordinate multi-axis operations like this?" The question hung in the air, and Maria realized that the moment she had been avoiding had finally arrived. Her cover story had stretched as far as it could go. Either she told them something closer to the truth, or she simplified the plan and accepted a less optimal outcome.
"Some questions don't have simple answers," she said finally.
"But if you're asking whether you can trust me to get you through this mission safely, the answer is yes." It wasn't a complete answer, but something in her tone convinced the squad that it was all the answer they were going to get.
And maybe all the answer they needed.
Sarah stepped forward.
"We trust you. What do you need us to do?"
The mission that followed would be talked about at Fort Benning for years afterward. Using a combination of misdirection, precise timing, and tactical innovation, Maria's squad not only rescued the civilian but also neutralized half the opposing force and captured their command post. But the real revelation came during the final phase of the operation, when everything went wrong and Maria had to improvise under pressure that would have broken most experienced soldiers. The opposing force, realizing they had been outmaneuvered, called in simulated artillery support that forced Maria's squad to take cover in an abandoned building. What should have been a temporary setback became a prolonged siege when the building's exits were covered by enemy positions. With night falling and no apparent way out, the squad looked to Maria for leadership. And what they saw was a transformation that none of them had been prepared for. The quiet, careful recruit they had known for 2 months disappeared, replaced by someone who moved and spoke with the confidence of combat experience. Maria didn't just adapt to the crisis, she embraced it, turning a desperate situation into an opportunity for victory. But, in doing so, she revealed skills and instincts that raised questions that could no longer be ignored. And, as the exercise reached its climax, Maria realized that the most important test she faced wasn't from the enemy force outside the building. It was from the growing suspicion in the eyes of her own squad members, who were beginning to understand that everything they thought they knew about Maria Santos might be a carefully constructed fiction. The abandoned building where Maria's squad had taken shelter was a concrete shell with broken windows and debris scattered across the floor. Outside, they could hear the opposing force taking positions, cutting off their escape routes. The simulation called for them to either surrender or attempt a breakout that would likely result in heavy casualties. Maria stood at a shattered window, studying the enemy positions with an intensity that made her squad members exchange worried glances. In the fading light, her profile looked different somehow, sharper, more focused, like a blade that had been honed by experiences none of them could imagine.
"We're surrounded," Marcus whispered, stating the obvious. "Maybe we should consider surrendering. This is just an exercise." Maria turned from the window, and several recruits took an unconscious step backward.
Something fundamental had changed in her demeanor. The careful, understated recruit they had known was gone, replaced by someone who radiated controlled lethality. "No one surrenders," she said quietly.
"Not on my watch."
Jennifer swallowed hard before speaking.
"Maria, I know you want to complete the mission, but the odds are impossible. There has to be at least 20 of them out there, and they have us completely cut off." 23, Maria corrected without hesitation. 2 squads plus a command element. Heavy weapons team set up in the building across the street. Sniper on the water tower. Mobile patrol circling the perimeter every 12 minutes.
The precision of her assessment sent a chill through the group. Sarah was the first to voice what everyone was thinking.
"How could you possibly know all that?"
"We've been pinned down here for less than 30 minutes.
Maria's response was to point to different positions around their improvised fortress. "Brooks, you were watching the east side. What did you see?" Tyler Brooks, the recruit from Montana, stammered slightly. I saw movement in the tree line. Maybe 4 or 5 soldiers."
"Wrong," Maria said flatly. "You saw 3 soldiers deliberately exposing themselves to draw your attention while 2 others moved into flanking positions 50 meters to their north.
The muzzle flash pattern from their last volley confirms 6 weapons, not 4 or 5.
She turned to Jackson.
"You were covering the south approach. Report." Jackson's earlier skepticism had evaporated entirely. "I counted 7 enemy positions based on their firing patterns. Close. 8 positions, but one of them is a decoy."
"No actual shooter, just a mirror angled to reflect muzzle flashes and make you think there's a gun position that doesn't exist." The squad stared at her in stunned silence. This level of tactical analysis was beyond anything they had been taught, beyond anything that made sense for someone with her claimed background. Marcus found his voice first.
"Who are you?"
The question hung in the air like smoke. Maria looked at each of them in turn, and, for a moment, her carefully maintained facade wavered. These people had become more than just fellow recruits over the past weeks. Despite the initial hostility and suspicion, they had developed into something approaching a real team. They deserved better than lies. But the truth was complicated and dangerous. And they were still in the middle of an exercise that required her full attention. "Right now, I'm your squad leader," she said finally. "And I'm going to get every one of you out of here alive. The rest can wait." Before anyone could respond, she was moving to different positions around the room, checking sightlines and studying the terrain outside with an efficiency that spoke of extensive experience. "Chen, you said your sister was a trauma nurse. Did she ever talk about triage procedures?" Sarah nodded, confused by the apparent change of subject. "Yes, but what does that have to do with same principle applies to tactical situations? You assess the situation, prioritize your objectives, and allocate your resources where they can do the most good." Maria pointed to the map she had spread on the floor. Right now, we have 8 able-bodied soldiers, limited ammunition, and enemy forces that think they have us trapped. She marked positions on the map as she spoke.
They're expecting us to either surrender or attempt a frontal breakout. We're going to do neither. What's the third option? Jennifer asked. Maria's smile was sharp and predatory.
We're going to capture their commander and turn this whole situation around.
The plan Maria outlined over the next 20 minutes was unlike anything the recruits had encountered in their training.
It wasn't just tactically sophisticated, it was psychologically complex, requiring each squad member to play a specific role in a deception that would convince the enemy they were dealing with a desperate, poorly trained group of recruits.
The plan hinged on several key elements: misdirection, precise timing, and the enemy's own assumptions about their capabilities.
But, most importantly, it relied on Maria's ability to operate independently in hostile territory while the rest of the squad created a diversion.
"This is insane," Jackson muttered as Maria finished the briefing. "You're talking about infiltrating their command post while we stage a fake surrender."
"If you get caught, I won't get caught," Maria said with quiet certainty.
"How can you be so sure?"
The question forced Maria to confront something she had been avoiding since arriving at Fort Benning. These people had trusted her with their lives, and she was asking them to trust her with an operation that would fail disastrously if she wasn't who she claimed to be.
"Because," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "I've done this before. Not in training. Not in exercises. For real." The admission sent a shock through the group.
Marcus leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper.
"What do you mean, for real?"
Maria was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words.
How much of the truth could she tell without compromising everything she had worked to build?
3 years ago, I was in a situation where bad people had good people trapped, and there was no cavalry coming to help.
I had to learn quickly how to think like a predator instead of prey.
She touched the scar on her shoulder unconsciously.
These marks aren't from an accident. They're from someone who thought I was helpless. What happened to him? Sarah asked quietly. Maria's expression was answer enough.
Sarah nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "That's why you joined the army," she said. "Not to prove something to yourself, but to prove something to the world."
"Maybe," Maria replied. "Or maybe I joined because I discovered I was good at something that could be used to protect people instead of just surviving them."
Jennifer stood up, decision written across her face.
"What do you need us to do?"
The operation that followed became legend among the observer controllers at Fort Benning. Years later, instructors would use video footage of the exercise to demonstrate advanced tactical concepts to officer candidates. The diversion phase went exactly as planned. Maria's squad staged a convincing attempt to surrender, drawing the attention of the opposing force while Maria slipped out through a drainage tunnel she had identified during her earlier reconnaissance. What happened next demonstrated skills that had nothing to do with civilian security work. Moving through enemy territory at night, Maria avoided multiple patrols, neutralized 2 sentries without raising an alarm, and infiltrated the opposing force's command post. But, instead of simply capturing the enemy commander as planned, she found something that changed the entire nature of the exercise.
The opposing force wasn't just playing the role of enemy soldiers.
They were conducting their own training exercise, testing new equipment and tactics that would be used in real combat situations. The exercise Maria's squad was participating in was actually a cover for evaluating how experienced soldiers would perform against unconventional opponents. The revelation meant that everything the recruits thought they knew about their final exercise was wrong. They weren't being tested just on their basic training skills. They were being used as unknowing participants in a much more sophisticated evaluation.
And Maria had just proven that at least one of the recruits was far more than she appeared to be.
The officer in charge of the opposing force was Colonel Rodriguez, the same officer who had questioned Maria after her performance in the urban warfare exercise. When she appeared in his command tent like a ghost, he wasn't entirely surprised. "I was wondering when you would surface," he said calmly, not looking up from the maps spread across his field table.
"Sir?" "Sit down, Santos. Or should I say, Agent Elena Vasquez of the Defense Intelligence Agency?" The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Her cover identity, so carefully constructed, had been unraveled. But how much did Rodriguez actually know? "I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand." Rodriguez finally looked up, and his expression was knowing. "Your performance has been extraordinary since day one. Too extraordinary for someone with your claimed background. So I made some calls. Ran some checks. Asked some questions of some very interesting people."
Maria remained silent, her mind racing through options and consequences.
The official record shows that Elena Vasquez was killed in action 18 months ago during a classified operation in South America. Posthumous decoration for heroism. Closed casket funeral. Very sad story. Rodriguez paused.
But the classified record tells a different tale. Deep cover agent who completed her mission but had to disappear afterward. New identity, new life, clean slate. The truth hung between them like a live wire. Maria could deny it, but Rodriguez clearly had sources that went deeper than any cover story could fool. "Why are you here, Agent Vasquez? Why basic training? Why the army?" Maria stared at the map on the table, seeing not the training area but memories of places where she had operated under different names, different identities, different lives. "Because Elena Vasquez died in that operation," she said quietly. "Not physically, but in every way that mattered. The person who walked out of that jungle wasn't someone who could go back to the old life." "And Maria Santos? Is who I need to be now. Someone who protects people instead of eliminating them. Someone who builds things instead of tearing them down." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "And your squad? They've been asking questions. They deserve answers. But not all of them. Not the ones that would put them in danger." "Fair enough." Rodriguez stood up, decision made. "Here's what's going to happen. This exercise ends now with your squad completing a successful mission.
Your performance will be noted as exemplary but not unprecedented.
You graduate with your class and receive your assignment." Maria felt a mixture of relief and apprehension.
"What assignment?" "That's still being decided.
There are people in Washington who are very interested in someone with your particular combination of skills and motivations. But, for now, you're still Maria Santos, recent graduate of basic training."
"And my squad?" "Will be told that you demonstrated exceptional leadership under pressure. Nothing more, nothing less."
As Maria prepared to leave the command tent, Rodriguez called her back.
"Agent Vasquez? Elena? Maria? Whoever you are now, those young people trust you. Don't abuse that trust." "I won't, sir."
"Good. Because watching you with them over the past weeks, I think Maria Santos might turn out to be exactly who Elena Vasquez was meant to become." The return to her squad required one final deception. Maria had to make her successful infiltration and capture of the enemy commander seem like a fortunate combination of training and determination rather than the application of skills that had been developed in situations where failure meant death. When the exercise officially ended and the observer controllers announced that Alpha Squad had achieved the highest evaluation scores in their class, the celebration was muted by a new understanding among the squad members. They had seen enough to know that Maria Santos was more than she appeared to be, but they had also learned to trust her judgment about what they needed to know and what they didn't. As they packed their gear and prepared to return to base, Jennifer approached Maria one final time.
"I don't know who you really are," she said quietly. "And I'm not sure I want to know. But I want you to know that whoever you were before, you're one of us now. You're our sister. And if you ever need anything, you call us." Maria nodded, feeling an emotion she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Elena Vasquez had died in a South American jungle, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The graduation ceremony was held on a Friday morning with families gathered to watch their sons and daughters transition from civilians to soldiers. Maria stood in formation with the rest of her platoon, wearing the same uniform and carrying the same pride in accomplishment.
But, when Colonel Rodriguez pinned her graduation badge to her uniform, he leaned close enough to whisper something that only she could hear.
"Welcome home, soldier."
Later that day, as the new graduates said their goodbyes and prepared to report to their first duty assignments, Maria found herself standing with the group that had started as her critics and ended as her family.
"So where are they sending you?" Marcus asked.
Maria looked at the orders in her hand.
"Fort Campbell. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Communications Specialist." "Special Operations?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. That's a pretty significant assignment for someone straight out of basic training."
"I guess they need people with my particular background," Maria replied with a slight smile. As the group dispersed began their journeys to new assignments and new chapters in their lives, Maria stood alone for a moment in the Georgia heat. Elena Vasquez had died to protect innocent people and preserve national security. Maria Santos had been born from that sacrifice and forged in the fires of basic training. But the woman who would report to Fort Campbell next week was someone new entirely, someone who carried the skills of Elena, the resilience of Maria, and the loyalty and brotherhood she had learned from a group of young people who had seen her at her worst and chosen to trust her at her best. The scars on her body would always remind her of where she had come from. But the badge on her uniform and the memories of the past weeks would remind her of where she was going. For the first time in years, that future felt bright with possibility.